In the quiet suburban dining room, amidst the clatter of silverware and the murmur of family chatter, a storm brewed. My own brother Derek, a police sergeant puffed up with self-importance, slammed my face against our grandmother's cold marble floor. "You're under arrest for impersonating a military officer and theft of government property," he snarled, his knee digging into my spine. Our entire extended family watched, frozen in disbelief, as the handcuffs bit into my wrists. His voice, dripping with the familiar contempt he'd harbored since childhood, continued, "I always knew. You were a fraud, Arya, playing dress-up, lying about some fake military career to make yourself feel important." The silence that followed was deafening. 23 family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, and our aging grandmother Rose, in her wheelchair, stared at me as if I were a common criminal dragged from their Sunday dinner table. Derek, in his crisp police uniform, stood over me with that smug satisfaction he always wore when he got to play the golden child. The real law enforcement officer with a legitimate badge and the respect that came with it. "Derek, please," our cousin Jasmine whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "Not like this, not in front of Grandma Rose." But Derek was in his element, performing for an audience that had always favored his conventional success over my mysterious absences and vague explanations about classified work. He'd been building this moment for months, perhaps years, meticulously collecting what he believed was evidence of my deception. Military medals in my apartment he'd photographed during a wellness check, dress uniforms he deemed too authentic to be replicas, and phone calls I took in other rooms, speaking in codes he couldn't understand. "She's been lying to all of you," he announced, his voice echoing off the crystal chandelier above our grandmother's antique dining table. "Living in some fantasy world where she's a decorated military hero instead of what she really is, a 32-year-old woman who never finished college, never held a real job, and spends her trust fund on military memorabilia to fool her own family." I felt the Persian rug scratch my cheek as he pressed my face harder into the floor, hearing the shocked gasps and murmured conversations ripple through the room. "Derek, child, what are you doing?" "This is Arya. This is your sister, Grandma." Rose's voice, fragile yet sharp, cut through the chaos. "This," Derek said, hauling me to my feet with unnecessary force, "is a criminal, and I'm doing my job." Just then, the front door burst open, rattling the windows. Combat boots thundered across the foyer's hardwood floors, and suddenly 6 figures in dress blues filled the dining room. Their uniforms bore insignia that made Derek's sergeant stripes look like toy store accessories. The man leading them, tall, silver-haired, with more ribbons on his chest than my family had ever seen outside a war movie, took one look at the scene. His face went white with what could only be described as pure terror. "Dear God," he breathed, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding thousands. "Sergeant, step away from her right now."
Derek's
grip on my arm loosened, confusion replacing his earlier confidence. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but this is police business. This woman is under arrest for what?" The silver-haired man's voice, sharp enough to cut glass, interrupted. He stepped forward, and I watched Derek instinctively recoil. Some primal recognition of superior authority overriding his civilian jurisdiction. For serving her country with more distinction than you could comprehend in 3 lifetimes. The room went deadly quiet. My grandmother's oxygen tank hissed softly. Someone's coffee cup clinked against a saucer. The man in dress blues looked directly at me, still handcuffed, still pressed against Derek's chest, still wearing the simple black dress I'd chosen for what was supposed to be a peaceful family dinner. His eyes met mine, and I saw something Derek had never shown me, something none of them had ever shown me: respect. He raised his hand to his temple in a crisp salute that echoed through the silence like a gunshot. "General Montgomery," he said, his voice carrying across the dining room like a prayer. "Colonel Richardson reporting. We received word there was a situation involving you. We came as soon as we could." The handcuffs fell from my wrists with a metallic clatter that seemed to reverberate through eternity. Derek stumbled backward, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. Behind him, 23 family members sat frozen, their half-eaten slices of Grandma Rose's famous peach cobbler growing cold on their plates. My name is Arya Montgomery. And from wherever you're watching this, stay with me, because what happened next in that dining room in Willowbrook changed everything. Not just for me, but for a family that had spent 32 years believing they knew exactly who I was, what I was worth, and how much respect I deserved. Have you ever been handcuffed by your own blood, humiliated in front of everyone you love, only to watch their faces transform from pity to shock to something approaching awe when they finally learn the truth about who you really are? Have you ever watched someone who spent their whole life looking down on you suddenly realize they'd been staring up at you the entire time? This is that story. The story of how a family dinner became a reckoning, how a brother's cruelty became his greatest mistake, and how sometimes the people who know you least are the ones who think they know you best. My name is Arya Montgomery, and I need you to understand something before we go any further. The woman you just saw being handcuffed on her grandmother's dining room floor wasn't the real me. That was the version of me my family had constructed over 3 decades of assumptions, dismissals, and comfortable lies they told themselves about who I was and what I was capable of. You see, there's something uniquely painful about being invisible to the people who raised you. Something soul-crushing about watching your own brother, your own flesh and blood, look at your life's work and see nothing but pretense and fraud. And if you've ever sat at a family table feeling like a stranger in your own story, like someone who doesn't quite belong in the narrative they've written about your life, then you'll understand why what happened in that dining room was 32 years in the making. I want you to stay with me through this, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about military service or family betrayal. It's about the space between who you are and who people need you to be. It's about the price we pay for protecting the people we love, even when they can't see the protection, can't understand the sacrifice, and definitely can't respect the woman making it. Growing up in Willowbrook, I was always the odd one out. Derek was 3 years older, 3 inches taller, and infinitely more suited to the traditional path our parents had mapped out for the Montgomery children. He played football, dated the homecoming queen, went to state college on a partial scholarship, and came home with a criminal justice degree that made our father beam with pride. "My son, the future police officer," Dad would say at neighborhood barbecues, clapping Derek on the shoulder like he'd already saved the world. Me? I was the question mark. The daughter who asked too many questions, who read military history instead of romance novels, who could field strip a rifle by age 16, but couldn't seem to care about the social dynamics that consumed my female classmates. While Derek was earning praise for his conventional successes, I was earning concerned looks for my unconventional interests. "Arya is going through a phase," my mother would tell her book club friends when they asked why I spent more time at the shooting range than the shopping mall. "She grow out of it when she meets the right boy." But I never grew out of it. Instead, I grew into it. While my classmates were picking colleges based on party reputations and proximity to home, I was researching military academies. Wow. They were planning sorority rushes. I was planning a career in service that would take me as far from Willowbrook's suffocating expectations as possible. The day I told my family I'd been accepted to the Riverside Military Academy was the day I learned what real disappointment looked like. Not anger disappointment. The kind of deep, bone-deep disappointment that says, "We expected better from you," without actually saying what better would have looked like. "Arya, honey," my mother said, setting down her coffee cup with the kind of careful precision that meant she was choosing her words even more carefully. "Don't you think you're being a little dramatic? The military is for people who don't have other options. You have options." Derek, home from his 2nd year at state, looked up from his textbook, some introduction to law enforcement course he'd been highlighting with the intensity of someone discovering fire. "She's just trying to get attention," he said without even looking at me. "Remember when she wanted to be a firefighter or a park ranger? She quit before basic training's over." That stung. Not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it revealed how little they understood about who I was becoming. They saw my military ambitions as another childhood phase, like collecting stamps or wanting to be a veterinarian. They couldn't see that every decision I'd made since age 14 had been building toward this moment. My father, ever the pragmatist, tried a different approach. Sweetheart, the military is a fine organization, but it's not really a place for girls like you. You're smart, you're pretty, you come from a good family, you could do anything. Teach school, work in an office, maybe meet a nice young man, and start a family of your own. Girls like me, as if he had any idea what girls like me were capable of. But here's what they didn't understand. What they couldn't see past their own limitations and fears. I wasn't running toward the military because I had no other options. I was running toward it because it was the only option that felt like home. The only path that promised to challenge everything I had to give and respect everything I was willing to sacrifice. And sacrifice, well, that was a word my family would learn to understand in ways they never expected. Have you ever felt like you were speaking a language your own family couldn't hear? Like every conversation was a translation that lost something essential in the process. That's what those last few months in Willowbrook felt like. A series of conversations where I was speaking fluent future and they were fluent past, and neither of us could find common ground in the present. So I stopped trying to make them understand. I stopped explaining my dreams and started living them. I stopped asking for their approval and started earning approval from people who understood what I was building. What I didn't know was that leaving for the academy wouldn't just change. It would freeze me in their minds exactly as I was at 18, young, uncertain, searching for direction. And no matter what I became in the years that followed, no matter what I achieved or how far I traveled or how much I sacrificed in service to, something larger than myself, I would always be Derek's little sister who was going through a phase. Until the day Colonel Richardson walked into that dining room, and everything they thought they knew about me shattered like glass. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon in September, handwritten on my grandmother's cream-colored stationery, with the little rose embossing she'd used for 60 years. Dearest Arya, it began in her careful script. I know it's been too long since we've all been together as a family. Would you consider coming home for Sunday dinner? It would mean the world to this old woman to have all her grandchildren around the table again. I was sitting in my office at Fort Harrington when I opened it, still wearing my ICUs from the morning briefing, my coffee growing cold as I read those carefully chosen words. Grandmother Rose had always been the diplomat of the family, the one who smoothed over tensions and bridged gaps that seemed unbridgeable. She'd never directly addressed the growing distance between Derek and me, never taken sides in the subtle war of family politics that had been brewing since I'd returned from my last deployment. But I could read between the lines of her invitation. She was worried. Worried about the fractures she could see forming in her family. Worried about the grandchildren who barely spoke to each other anymore. Worried about conversations that stopped when certain people entered the room. It had been 8 months since I'd been home to Willowbrook. 8 months since Derek's graduation ceremony from the police academy, where I'd sat in the back row in civilian clothes, watching him receive his badge while our parents beamed from the front row. I tried to congratulate him afterward, tried to bridge the gap with some shared understanding of service and duty, but he'd looked through me like I was a stranger, offering unwanted familiarity. Thanks, Arya, he'd said, with the kind of polite distance reserved for acquaintances you're trying to escape. I'm sure you understand what this means to me, having a real career and all. A real career. The words had stung then, and they stung now as I reread grandmother's invitation. But Rose was family, and she was 87 years old, and she'd never asked for much from us. How could I refuse? I called her that evening from my quarters, the satellite phone crackling with the kind of connection that reminded you how far Fort Harrington was from anywhere that felt like home. Grandmother, it's Arya. I got your invitation. Oh, sweetheart. Her voice brightened in that way that made you remember why you loved her so fiercely as a child. Does that mean you'll come? I know you're busy with your work. She always said it like that, with a pause that acknowledged she didn't fully understand what my work entailed but respected it anyway. I'll be there, I told her, already calculating flight times and leave requests. What time should I arrive? 2 o'clock sharp. You know how I feel about punctuality? And Arya, wear something nice, dear. Something that shows how well you're doing. I want everyone to see how proud I am of my granddaughter. Something nice. I smiled despite myself, imagining her mental catalog of what constituted appropriate Sunday dinner attire. Grandmother Rose still believed in the transformative power of a good dress and pearl earrings. Still thought that looking the part was half the battle in any social situation. I'll dress appropriately, I promised her, not mentioning that my definition of appropriate might differ significantly from the rest of the family's expectations. The flight from Fort Harrington to Riverside Regional took 4 hours, including a layover in Atlanta that gave me time to second-guess my decision. I spent the connection scrolling through my phone, catching up on emails from my staff, reviewing intelligence briefings that couldn't wait until Monday. The civilian world felt strange around me. All these people living their lives with such obvious ease, such freedom from the weight of classified information and strategic responsibilities. A group of college students at the gate next to mine were debating whether to spend their weekend money on concert tickets or new textbooks. Their biggest concern was a chemistry exam on Tuesday. I envied them, that simplicity, that luxury of problems with clear solutions and predictable consequences. My phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Patricia Hawthorne, my second in command. General, the situation in Kandahar is developing. Do you need us to delay the briefing until you return? I typed back quickly, proceed as planned. I'll review your recommendations Monday morning. Handle it, Patricia. You've got this. The trust required for that exchange, the years of training, an experience that made it possible for me to delegate something so critical while sitting in an airport terminal, felt like another world compared to the family dynamics I was walking back into. In my professional life, respect was earned through competence and given through recognition of results. In Willowbrook, I was still the girl who'd made unconventional choices and disappointed conventional expectations. The rental car at Riverside Regional was a silver sedan that felt absurdly normal after months of armored vehicles and military transports. I drove the familiar roads to Willowbrook with muscle memory. Past the high school where Derek had been a star athlete and I'd been the weird girl who read military histories during lunch. Past the community center where our parents had hosted Derek's police academy graduation party, complete with a cake shaped like a badge and speeches about service and dedication that hadn't quite managed to include me in their definition of serving one's community. Grandmother Rose's house looked exactly the same. White colonial with blue shutters, rose bush she'd been tending for 40 years. The same brass mailbox that had held birthday cards and Christmas gifts throughout our childhood. I parked behind Derek's police cruiser, noting that he'd driven his official vehicle to Sunday dinner, probably hoping someone would notice the authority it represented. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. I'd chosen a simple black dress, elegant but not ostentatious, professional but not intimidating. My grandmother had asked me to dress to show how well I was doing, but she'd also asked for family dinner, not a military review. I'd left my medals at home, worn minimal makeup, tied my hair back in a simple ponytail. I looked like what I'd always been in this house, Derek's younger sister, home for Sunday dinner. The front door opened before I could knock, and there was Rose in her Sunday best, pearls and all, her face lighting up like I was the answer to a prayer she'd been too polite to voice. Arya, darling! Oh, you look wonderful, just wonderful. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender and Sunday roast, like every childhood comfort I'd carried with me through 3 deployments and 7 years of service. Everyone's here, sweetheart. Everyone's so excited to see you. As she led me through the familiar hallway toward the dining room, I could hear the conversation already in progress. Derek's voice explaining some recent arrest. Uncle Martin asking about new police procedures. Cousin Jasmine laughing at some story about her kids. It sounded warm and normal and exactly like the kind of family gathering I'd been missing without realizing it. What I didn't know was that Derek had spent the last 3 months building a case against me in whispered conversations, and carefully planted doubts. What I couldn't see was the trap that had been set with the same precision he'd learned in police training, using the very love and trust that had brought me home as weapons against the truth I'd spent 7 years protecting. I was walking into that dining room as Arya, beloved granddaughter, ready to bridge gaps and heal old wounds. I had no idea I was about to become Arya, suspected criminal, in front of 23 people who thought they knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. The first sign that something was wrong came during the appetizers. I was sitting between Cousin Jasmine and Aunt Helen, making small talk about Jasmine's twins and Helen's new garden when Derek cleared his throat with that particular authority he'd cultivated since joining the police force. "So, Arya," he said, his voice carrying across the mahogany table like he was calling a meeting to order, "I've been curious about something. You've been away for, 8 months now. Still doing that consulting work?" The way he said consulting work made it sound like a euphemism for unemployment. I took a sip of my water, noting how the conversation around the table had shifted, how everyone was suddenly listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for family gossip or scandal. "Something like that," I replied evenly, not willing to get drawn into whatever game he was playing in front of our grandmother's crystal and good china. "That's interesting," Derek continued, cutting into his prime rib with surgical precision, "because I've been doing some research into government consulting firms, for work. Part of understanding how different agencies interact with local law enforcement, and it's funny, I can't seem to find any record of the company you claim to work for." Uncle Martin looked up from his mashed potatoes. "What company is that, honey?" he asked me with genuine curiosity. Uncle Martin had always been kind, had always treated my unconventional path with more respect than most of the family. I felt the familiar weight of classification protocols, the careful dance I'd been performing for years to protect both my work and my family's safety.
"It's a small firm," I said. "We do specialized work."
"Most of our contracts are discreet." Derek laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Discreet, right? That's a convenient way to avoid giving any actual details." He turned to address the table at large, his voice taking on the tone he probably used when testifying in court. "Has anyone else noticed that Arya never talks about her work? Never mentions colleagues, never brings anyone from her job to family events. It's almost like this mysterious career of hers doesn't actually exist." "Derek," Grandmother Rose said quietly, but there was steel underneath the gentleness. "This is Sunday dinner, not an interrogation. I'm just asking questions. Grandma, questions any normal family would ask when someone's been vague about their life for 7 years. He leaned back in his chair, and I could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the pleasure he was taking in having an audience for whatever performance he'd planned. Cousin Rebecca, always eager to be part of the drama, jumped in with poorly concealed excitement. "I have to admit, I've wondered too. I mean, Arya, you travel all the time. You never talk about your job and you always seem to have money, but we never know where it comes from. It is a little mysterious." "Mysterious in a good way," Aunt Helen said quickly, trying to diffuse the tension. "Arya's always been independent. Some people are just private about their work." "Private is one thing," Derek shot back. "Secretive is another. And when someone claims to be doing important government work but can't provide a single verifiable detail, that raises red flags? At least it should for people who care about honesty in their family." The word honesty hung in the air like a challenge. I felt 23 pairs of eyes on me, felt the weight of their curiosity and confusion and growing doubt. These people had watched me grow up, had celebrated my birthdays and graduations, had sent care packages when I was away at the academy. Now they were looking at me like I was a stranger who'd infiltrated their family gathering under false pretenses. "Red flags," I repeated, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "Derek, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, I'm stating facts." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder that he'd apparently been carrying all evening, waiting for this moment. "I'm stating that in 7 years of this supposed government career, you've never once provided proof of employment. I'm stating that you have no verifiable job history that anyone in this family can confirm. I'm stating that you live well beyond any realistic means for someone with your educational background.
He opened the folder and began pulling out photographs.
Surveillance photos, I realized with growing horror. Photos of me entering my apartment building. Photos of my car, photos of me at the dry cleaner picking up what were clearly military uniforms. I'm also stating, Derek continued, his voice growing stronger as he saw the shock on our family's faces, that you possess what appear to be military uniforms and decorations that you have no right to own, which, in case anyone doesn't know, is a federal crime. The room erupted. Voices overlapped in a chaos of confusion, concern, and disbelief. Grandmother Rose's hand flew to her chest. Uncle Martin started asking questions that Derek ignored. Jasmine's teenage daughter pulled out her phone like she was witnessing something that belonged on social media. Derek, stop this, I said. But my voice was lost in the commotion. Stop what? Stop asking legitimate questions about illegal behavior? Derek was standing now, towering over the table like a prosecutor addressing a jury. Stop trying to protect this family from someone who's been lying to them for years. What are you talking about? Grandmother Rose's voice cut through the noise, sharp with confusion and growing alarm. Derek, what are you saying about your sister? I'm saying she's not who she claims to be, Grandma. I'm saying she's been running some kind of con game on this entire family, and we've all been too trusting to see it. He pulled out another photograph, this one showing me in dress blues entering what looked like a government building. These uniforms aren't costumes from a military surplus store. They're too detailed, too accurate, which means she either stole them from actual service members or she's impersonating a military officer, which is a federal crime punishable by up to 3 years in prison. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, could hear someone's breathing becoming labored, probably Uncle Carl, who had a heart condition and didn't handle stress well. Arya, Grandmother Rose's voice was small, uncertain. Nothing like the confident woman who'd welcomed me at the door an hour earlier. Honey, what is Derek talking about? I looked around the table at faces I'd known my entire life, saw confusion morphing into suspicion, saw love being replaced with doubt. These people had raised me, had cheered at my high school graduation, had sent me care packages when I was away at the academy. Now they were looking at me like I was a stranger who'd infiltrated their family gathering under false pretenses. Derek, I said quietly, you don't understand what you're doing. I understand perfectly. I'm doing my job. I'm protecting my family from a fraud. He was enjoying this now, basking in the attention and authority. I've been investigating you for months, Arya, documenting the inconsistencies, gathering evidence, building a case. And what I found is someone who's been living a complete lie. He pulled out the final photograph, me in full dress uniform with decorations that most of the family wouldn't recognize, but that clearly impressed them with their official appearance. These medals, these ribbons, these rank insignia, they're not earned, they're purchased. She's been playing dress-up with military honors that belong to people who actually served, people who actually sacrificed for their country, people like the officers I work with every day. Who would be disgusted to see their service mocked by someone buying fake credentials online? The accusation hit me like a physical blow. 7 years of actual service, 3 deployments, countless hours of briefings and decisions and responsibilities that kept me awake at night, all of it reduced to playing dress-up, in front of the people who should have known me better than anyone. That's enough, I said, standing up from the table. No, it's not enough. It's not nearly enough. Derek was reaching for his handcuffs now, his movements deliberate and practiced. Because impersonating a military officer isn't just fraud. It's stolen valor. It's taking credit for sacrifices you never made, claiming honor you never earned. And I won't sit here and watch you lie to our grandmother's face anymore. That's when I realized this wasn't just a confrontation. It was an arrest. Derek hadn't come to Sunday dinner to question me. He'd come to handcuff me in front of our entire family, to destroy not just my reputation, but any possibility of explaining the truth they weren't cleared to hear. The handcuffs came out with a metallic click that seemed to echo through the dining room like a gunshot. I watched Derek's fingers work with practiced efficiency. The same hands that used to help me build sandcastles when we were children now preparing to arrest me in front of our grandmother's Sunday roast. Derek Montgomery, what do you think you're doing? Grandmother Rose's voice had found its strength. Again, the tone she'd used when we were children and someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I'm placing Arya under arrest for impersonating a military officer and theft of government property, Derek said, his voice taking on the official cadence he'd learned at the police academy. He was reading from a script now, playing the role he'd rehearsed. Ma'am, I need you to understand that what's happening here is necessary. Your granddaughter has been committing federal crimes, and as a sworn officer of the law, I have a duty to act. The word duty coming from his mouth felt like blasphemy. I thought about the real meaning of that word, about the weight it carried when your duty required you to make decisions that could cost lives, when your duty meant carrying secrets that could destroy families, when your duty meant protecting people who would never know your name or understand your sacrifice. You have the right to remain silent, Derek continued, stepping toward me with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Derek, stop. The words came out quietly, but something in my tone made him pause mid-step. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm arresting a criminal who happens to be my sister.
His voice cracked slightly on the word sister, the first.
Sign that this performance was costing him something too. Someone who's been lying to this family for 7 years. Someone who's been taking advantage of our trust and our grandmother's love to cover up her fraud. Uncle Martin stood up from his chair, his face flushed with confusion and growing anger. Now, wait just a minute, Derek. This is family business. This is your sister. Whatever's going on here, we can handle it privately. Work it out among ourselves. No, we can't. Derek's voice was getting louder, more insistent. Because this isn't just family business. This is criminal business. This is federal law enforcement business, and I swore an oath to uphold the law, regardless of personal relationships. Aunt Helen was crying now, soft tears she tried to hide behind her napkin. Cousin Rebecca had her phone out, probably texting her friends about the drama unfolding at the Montgomery family dinner. Jasmine was trying to shield her teenage daughter from the worst of it, whispering for her to go wait in the kitchen. But Grandmother Rose sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching this destruction of her family with the kind of quiet devastation that was somehow worse than screaming. Grandma, I said softly, looking directly at her while Derek fumbled with his handcuffs. I need you to know that I have never lied to you. I have never done anything to dishonor this family or the values you taught me. Then explain these. Derek interrupted, waving the photographs of me in military uniform. Explain why you have decorations for battles you never fought, ranks you never earned, honors that belong to real soldiers who actually served their country. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. Real soldiers. If only he knew that the woman he was about to arrest had spent the last 18 months coordinating intelligence operations across 3 continents, had briefed senators and generals, had made decisions that affected the safety of thousands of service members he claimed to respect. I can't explain them, I said simply. Not here, not like this. Because you can't explain lies, Derek shot back. You can't explain fraud. You can't explain stolen valor because there's no explanation that makes it acceptable. He moved behind me then, reaching for my hands to cuff them behind my back. The touch of his fingers on my wrists felt like a violation, like every childhood memory we'd shared was being poisoned by this moment. Derek, please, Jasmine whispered from across the table. Not in front of Grandma, not like this. But Derek was past listening to family pleas. He was operating on pure righteousness now, convinced that he was saving us all from a deception that had gone on too long. She made this choice when she decided to lie to her own family, he said, clicking the first handcuff into place. She made this choice when she decided to mock the service of real military personnel. The metal was cold against my skin, tighter than it needed to be. I could feel Derek's satisfaction in the precise way he adjusted the cuffs, could sense his belief that he was finally, after 32 years, the one with power in our relationship. You know what the worst part is? He said, his mouth close to my ear as he secured the second cuff. The worst part is that we all believed you. We all made excuses for your secrecy, your absences, your mysterious lifestyle. We told ourselves you were just private, just independent. When the truth is, you're just a fraud who got too comfortable living in a fantasy. That's when something inside me broke. Not my resolve. I'd been trained to maintain composure under interrogation, under pressure that would have crushed most people. What broke was my willingness to protect him from the consequences of his ignorance. Derek, I said, my voice steady despite the handcuffs, despite the tears on my grandmother's face, despite the family dinner that would never recover from this moment. I want you to remember this. I want you to remember every word you've said. Tonight, every accusation you've made, every photograph you've shown. Because when you learn the truth, and you will learn the truth, I want you to remember that I gave you every opportunity to stop. He pushed me toward the wall then, the same way he'd probably pushed dozens of actual criminals. His hand on my shoulder with enough force to show everyone in the room that he was in control. Now hear this, you're under arrest, he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The only truth is that this family deserves better than someone who built her entire identity on lies. I could have told him then. Could have revealed enough to stop this humiliation.
Could.
Have given him just enough classified information to make him understand how catastrophically wrong he was. But that would have required breaking protocols that existed to protect national security. Would have required compromising operations that were bigger than my family's understanding or Derek's need to feel important. So instead I stood there, against my grandmother's dining room wall, handcuffed by my own brother, watching 23 people I loved look at me like I was a stranger who had infiltrated their lives. I'm sorry, Grandma, I said quietly, the only words that felt true in a room full of accusations and misunderstandings. I'm sorry this is happening in your house. Rose looked at me with eyes that had seen 87 years of family drama, 87 years of secrets and revelations and children who broke her heart in ways they never intended. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered. And in those two words, I heard both heartbreak and something else, something that sounded almost like faith. Derek was calling for backup, speaking into his radio with the efficiency of someone who believed he'd just solved a major case. He had no idea that in approximately 3 minutes his entire world was about to change. He had no idea that the backup responding to his call included people who knew exactly who I was and exactly what he'd just done. He had no idea that the woman he'd just handcuffed for impersonating a military officer was about to be saluted by his own captain. The backup Derek had called for arrived faster than anyone expected, but not in the way he'd anticipated. Instead of the standard police response he'd requested, what came through Grandmother Rose's front door was something that would haunt his nightmares for years to come. Colonel Richardson entered first, his dress blues immaculate, his bearing unmistakably military, even before you noticed the insignia that marked him as someone accustomed to commanding thousands. Behind him came Major Sarah Blackstone, Captain H. Rodriguez, and 3 other officers whose combined decorations represented more combat experience than Derek had ever seen outside of war movies. The sound of their boots on Rose's hardwood floors was like thunder, each step precise and purposeful in a way that made Derek's civilian police training look like amateur theatrics. They moved with the kind of coordinated authority that comes from years of real service, real responsibility, real consequence for failure. Derek's radio had gone silent. The casual banter and routine communications of small-town police work had been replaced by something much more serious, much more official. His dispatcher's voice had changed, too, taking on the careful formality reserved for situations that involved federal agencies and clearance levels above her pay grade. Sergeant Montgomery. Colonel Richardson's voice cut across the dining room like a blade. Step away from General Montgomery. Step away from her immediately. General Montgomery. The words hung in the air like a revelation that rewrote everything everyone thought they knew about reality. Uncle Martin's fork clattered to his plate. Aunt Helen's hand flew to her mouth. Cousin Rebecca stopped mid-text, her phone forgotten. as she stared at the woman she'd known as Derek's mysterious little sister. Derek's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances: confusion, disbelief, defiance, and finally, slowly, the dawning horror of someone who realizes they've made an error so catastrophic it can't be undone. "I don't know what kind of game this is," Derek said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried minutes earlier. "But this woman is under arrest for impersonating a military officer. I have evidence of fraud, stolen valor, illegal possession of military property." "Sergeant," Major Blackstone interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from actually commanding troops in combat zones rather than arresting drunk drivers in small towns. "You have evidence of nothing, except your own ignorance. What you have done is handcuff a decorated general in front of her family, accuse her of crimes she has never committed, and compromise the security of operations you lack the clearance to understand." She pulled out a leather portfolio and began reading from documents that Derek couldn't see, but that clearly contained information that made his arrest look like a child playing cops and robbers. "General Arya Montgomery, United States Army, serial number classified, current assignment classified, security clearance level classified, graduate of Riverside Military Academy, class valedictorian, officer candidate school, distinguished graduate, Ranger School, second woman in program history to complete training without recycling, Defense Language Institute, fluent in 4 languages, master's degree in international relations from Georgetown, completed while on active duty." Each qualification hit the room like a physical blow. This wasn't the mysterious sister who dropped out of conventional life to pursue some vague consulting career. This was a woman who had achieved things that most people couldn't even comprehend, who had earned respect at levels Derek would never reach. Current decorations include the Defense Superior Service Medal, Legion of Merit with Oak Leaf Cluster, Bronze Star Medal with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters, Purple Heart Combat Action Badge, Ranger Tab, Master Parachutist Badge, and approximately 30 other awards for service in classified operations across 3 theaters of combat. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his own impressive array of ribbons somehow diminished by comparison to what Major Blackstone was describing. "General Montgomery has served with distinction in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other locations. I'm not authorized to discuss in present company. She has commanded units ranging from company to brigade level, has briefed members of Congress and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and currently holds one of the most sensitive positions in military intelligence." Derek's handcuffs suddenly felt like the most ridiculous objects in the room. The photographs he'd taken of Arya in military uniform, the evidence he'd gathered of her fraudulent claims, the case he'd built against her stolen valor, all of it collapsed into the absurdity of a small-town police sergeant trying to arrest a general for wearing the uniform she'd earned through 7 years of service that had taken her places he couldn't imagine. "The uniforms you photographed," Colonel Richardson continued, his voice taking on an edge that suggested Derek was about to understand the full scope of his mistake, "represent actual service. The medals you claim she purchased online were earned in combat operations you'll never hear about in places you'll never go, making decisions that kept Americans safe while you were learning to write traffic tickets." Grandmother Rose hadn't said a word since the officers entered, but I could see her mind working, connecting dots that had been scattered across 7 years of mysterious absences and vague explanations. The granddaughter who couldn't talk about her work, who traveled constantly, who seemed to have money but never explained where it came from suddenly. It all made sense in a way that Derek's accusations never could. "My God," Uncle Martin whispered, his voice barely audible. "Arya, all this time you've been serving her country." Major Blackstone finished. "At a level that requires security clearances your brother will never qualify for, making sacrifices he'll never understand, carrying responsibilities that would break most people." The room had gone completely silent except for the grandfather clock and Derek's increasingly labored breathing. He was still holding the manila folder of evidence, still wearing the confidence of someone who believed he'd exposed a fraud. But his hands were shaking now as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his shock. "Those phone calls she takes in other rooms," Captain Rodriguez addressed the family directly. Classified briefings with foreign assets. Those trips. She can't talk about. Diplomatic missions and intelligence operations. Those long absences from family events. Deployments to combat zones where she commanded soldiers in operations that will never make the news. But that kept terrorist attacks from happening on American soil. Jasmine was crying now, but these weren't tears of confusion or betrayal. These were tears of recognition, of understanding, of pride mixed with guilt for doubting someone who had been protecting them in ways they never knew they needed protection. Every time you questioned her service, Colonel Richardson said, his voice growing colder as he addressed Derek directly. Every time you suggested she was fraudulent or deceptive, you were insulting not just her sacrifice, but the sacrifice of every soldier who has served under her command, some of whom died following her orders, some of whom are alive today because of her decisions. Derek's face had gone completely white. The folder slipped from his hands, scattering his surveillance photographs across Rose's Persian rug. Images that now looked like a stalker's obsession rather than a police investigation. The consulting firm that doesn't exist in public records? Major Blackstone pulled out another document. Defense Intelligence Agency, the building you photographed her entering. The Pentagon, the colleagues she never mentions. They're classified. The specific nature of her work is above your security clearance and your need to know. I watched my brother's world crumble with each revelation. Watched him realize that everything he thought he knew about me, about military service, about his own importance in the grand scheme of law enforcement was wrong. But what struck me most wasn't his humiliation. It was the look on my grandmother's face. Not shock, not confusion, but something that looked almost like relief, as if she'd known all along that there was more to my story than I could tell, as if she'd been waiting 7 years for someone to finally explain why her granddaughter had to carry so many secrets. The handcuffs came off with a click that sounded like justice. Colonel Richardson handled them personally, his movements careful and respectful as he freed my wrists from the restraints my own brother had placed there. The metal had left red marks on my skin, marks that would fade, but that everyone in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. Derek stood frozen in the center of his grandmother's dining room, still wearing his police uniform but looking smaller somehow, diminished by the presence of officers whose authority dwarfed
His own. His badge, which had seemed so important an hour earlier,
now looked like a child's toy compared to the ribbons and insignia surrounding him. General Montgomery, Colonel Richardson said formally, on behalf of the United States Army and the Defense Intelligence Agency, I apologize for this incident. Your security detail has been briefed, and measures are being taken to ensure nothing like this happens again. Security detail. The words rippled through the room like another revelation. My family was learning that the woman they'd watched grow up, the sister they'd doubted, the granddaughter they'd questioned, lived in a world where people were assigned to protect her because her life had value beyond their understanding. Thank you, Colonel, I replied, rubbing my wrists where the handcuffs had been. But the fault isn't yours. This is a family matter that got out of hand. Major Blackstone stepped forward, her expression grim. With respect, General, this stopped being a family matter the moment a local law enforcement officer detained a flag officer on false charges. This is now a matter of national security, military protocol, and frankly, criminal investigation. Derek's face went even wider. Criminal investigation. Sergeant Montgomery, Captain Rodriguez addressed him with the kind of professional courtesy that somehow made the situation worse. You have just committed several federal crimes: false arrest of a military officer, interference with classified operations, compromise of national security assets. Each carries significant prison time. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Aunt Helen made a small sound of distress. Uncle Martin loosened his tie like he couldn't breathe. Grandmother Rose closed her eyes as if she could shut out this nightmare that had invaded her Sunday dinner. But I didn't know, Derek whispered, his voice breaking like it had when he was 12 and had broken Dad's fishing rod. I didn't know. I thought she was lying. I thought I was protecting the family from fraud. Your ignorance, Major Blackstone said coldly, is not a defense. It's evidence of negligence so profound it borders on criminal stupidity. Did you run her fingerprints? Did you check federal databases? Did you contact any federal agencies before deciding to arrest someone you suspected of impersonating a federal officer? Derek's silence was answer enough. He'd acted on assumption and jealousy, on years of resentment toward a sister whose success he couldn't understand or match. He'd built a case based on surveillance and suspicion rather than actual investigation. And now that case had collapsed into a career-ending disaster. The photographs you took, Colonel Richardson continued, pulling out Derek's scattered evidence, constitute surveillance of a classified military asset. The information you gathered about General Montgomery's residence, her movements, her personal life, all of it represents intelligence gathering against a high-value target. In other circumstances, we'd be discussing espionage charges. Cousin. Rebecca had gone completely silent, her phone forgotten on the table. The same woman who'd been ready to post about family drama on social media was now realizing she'd witnessed something that could have national security implications. Espionage? Derek's voice cracked. I'm a police officer. I serve my community. I would never— You serve a small town in central nowhere, Captain Rodriguez interrupted. You write speeding tickets and arrest drunk college students. You have no training in federal law, no understanding of military protocol, and apparently no common sense when it comes to investigating claims that fall outside your jurisdiction. The contempt in his voice was surgical, precise, designed to cut through Derek's self-importance and expose the reality of his situation. A small-town cop who thought he could play in the federal leagues and had discovered he didn't even understand the rules. Uncle Martin finally found his voice. What? What happens now to Derek? I mean, to the family? Colonel Richardson exchanged glances with his fellow officers, a silent communication that spoke of protocols and procedures the Montgomery family would never understand. That depends, he said finally, on several factors. The extent of damage to ongoing operations, the general's preferences regarding prosecution, the ability of local law enforcement to maintain discretion about classified matters they should never have been exposed to. Discretion. The word hung in the air like a threat and a lifeline simultaneously. They were being told that their knowledge of my real identity, my actual service, the operations they just learned about, all of it was classified information they now had to carry without fully understanding what it meant. You mean we can't talk about this? Jasmine said quietly. We can't tell anyone what we learned today. You can't tell anyone anything, Major Blackstone confirmed. Not your friends, not your co-workers, not your spouses who aren't present today. What you witnessed here today is classified at levels that could result in federal prosecution if disclosed. The irony was perfect and terrible. For 7 years, I've been unable to tell my family about my real life because of security clearances. They didn't have. Now they couldn't tell anyone about learning the truth for exactly the same reason. Derek was staring at his hands, at the photographs scattered around his feet, at the wreckage of his assumptions and his career. My job, he whispered. My department. They'll have to be notified. There'll be an investigation, reports, questions. I can't answer. Your job, Colonel Richardson said with finality, is over. As of this moment, you're suspended pending federal investigation. Your security clearance, what little you had, is revoked. Your access to law enforcement databases is terminated. And frankly, Sergeant, you should be grateful if unemployment is the worst consequence you face. The woman who'd raised me, who taught me about dignity and grace under pressure, finally spoke. Will someone please tell me? Grandmother Rose said in her strongest voice. How long my granddaughter has been in danger? How long she's been doing this work that requires armed guards and security details? Major Blackstone looked at me, asking permission with her eyes. I nodded slightly. 7 years, ma'am, since she graduated from the academy. She served in some of the most dangerous assignments the military offers, in some of the most sensitive positions in government, the work she does. It's work that keeps Americans safe from threats they never hear about. Rose looked at me then, really looked at me, seeing not the mysterious granddaughter who couldn't talk about her job, but the woman who had been carrying the weight of national security on her shoulders since she was 25 years old. And we questioned her, she said softly. We doubted her. We let Derek arrest her in my dining room for being exactly what she's supposed to be. The guilt in her voice was devastating because it was undeserved. They doubted me because I couldn't tell them the truth, because I'd chosen to protect them from knowledge that could make them targets rather than burden them with secrets they couldn't share. But Derek had chosen something else. He'd chosen suspicion over trust, investigation over faith, public humiliation over private conversation. And now he was learning that choices have consequences, especially when those choices involve people whose importance you're too small to understand. The first attempt came 3 days later, delivered not by Derek himself, but through Uncle Martin, who showed up at my temporary quarters at Fort Harrington, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in 72 hours. "Arya, honey," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway of what was essentially a luxury apartment that the army provided for officers of my rank. "Can we talk about Derek? About what happened? About maybe finding a way forward?" I let him in because Martin had always been the family peacemaker, the one who smoothed over holiday arguments and negotiated truces between cousins who'd stopped speaking to each other.
He meant well, but he was operating under the fundamental
misunderstanding that this was a family dispute that could be resolved with good intentions and compromise. "Derek asked you to come," I said, pouring him coffee from the machine that had been standard issue in my quarters since the security upgrade. It wasn't a question. Martin nodded, settling into the leather chair across from my desk like he was entering a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. He's not doing well, Arya. He hasn't slept since Sunday. He hasn't eaten. He's been suspended from the force. And there are federal investigators asking questions about his entire career, reviewing every case he's ever worked." The coffee tasted bitter, but I kept drinking it because I needed something to do with my hands while Martin delivered what was clearly a rehearsed plea for mercy. "He knows he made a mistake," Martin continued. "A terrible, terrible mistake. But he's family, Arya. He's your brother, and he's begging for a chance to apologize, to make this right somehow. Make it right." I set down my cup. "Harder than necessary." "Martin, he handcuffed me in front of our entire family. He accused me of federal crimes, of stolen valor, of being a fraud who was taking advantage of Grandmother Rose's love.
He built a surveillance case against me like I was a terrorist."
How exactly does someone make that right?" Martin flinched at the word terrorist, probably because that's exactly what Derek's investigation had looked like to the federal agents now reviewing his files.
He thought he was protecting the family. He thought he was finally going to prove
that his successful sister was really a failure like him. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but the truth usually does. This wasn't about protecting anyone, Martin. This was about Derek's ego, Derek's resentment, Derek's need to cut me down to a size he could handle. The silence stretched between us, filled with the hum of classified computers and the distant sound of military aircraft that reminded both of us how far we were from the world of family dinners and Sunday pot roast.
"He's facing federal charges, Arya," Martin said quietly.
"Prison time, the end of his career, his pension, everything he's worked for. His wife is talking about divorce. His kids don't understand why Daddy can't come home. The whole family is. We're falling apart." I felt a familiar weight in my chest. The same weight I'd carried through 3 deployments and countless classified operations. The weight of making decisions that would affect people's lives in ways they'd never understand. But this time, it wasn't enemy combatants or foreign assets whose futures hung in the balance. It was my own family. "What exactly is Derek asking for?" I said finally. Martin leaned forward like a man grasping for a lifeline. "He wants to meet with you, just the 2 of you. No lawyers, no federal agents, no family. He wants to apologize properly and ask if there's any way at all, that you might consider not pressing charges." The request hung in the air like smoke from a grenade, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Derek wanted mercy from the sister he'd tried to destroy. Forgiveness from the woman he'd handcuffed for being exactly what she claimed to be. "And if I refuse?" "Then he goes to prison," Martin said simply. Probably for a long time in our family. Our family learns to live with the fact that we destroyed ourselves over Sunday dinner. The phone calls started that evening, not from Derek directly. He was probably under orders not to contact me, but from everyone else. Aunt Helen, voice trembling with guilt and desperation. Cousin Rebecca, suddenly understanding that her social media drama had been someone's actual life. Jasmine crying about her children, asking why Uncle Derek looked so sad and why Cousin Uriah never came to family gatherings anymore. Each conversation followed the same pattern: shock at learning who I really was, guilt over doubting me, and a desperate plea to somehow fix what Derek had broken. They talked about family loyalty, about forgiveness, about the importance of blood ties and second chances. What none of them understood was that Derek's actions had consequences beyond our family dynamics. The federal investigation wasn't something I could call off with a phone call. The security breach he'd caused by surveilling a classified asset wasn't something that disappeared because we were related. The damage to military protocols and intelligence operations wasn't something that could be healed with an apology and a promise to do better. Grandmother Rose's call came on Friday night, her voice as strong as I'd ever heard it. "Arya, sweetheart, I need you to listen to me," she said without preamble. "I've lived 87 years on this earth, and I've learned that holding grudges hurts the holder more than the held. Derek made a terrible mistake, but he's still your brother. He's still my grandson, and this family needs healing more than it needs justice." "Grandma," I said carefully, "this isn't about grudges. This is about federal law, about military security, This is about a family that's tearing itself apart." She interrupted with the authority of someone who'd raised 3 generations of Montgomerys. "This is about children who won't grow up knowing their uncle, about holidays that will never be the same, about a brother and sister who let pride and misunderstanding destroy something that took 32 years to build." Her words carried the weight of decades of family history that stretched back long before Derek and I were born. But they also carried the weight of innocence, of someone who still believed that family love could overcome federal crimes and security breaches. "What are you asking me to do, Grandma?" "I'm asking you to remember that Derek isn't your enemy," she said. "He's a foolish boy who made a catastrophic mistake, but he's not evil. He's not a criminal mastermind. He's your brother who was jealous and stupid and proud. And now he's paying a price that might destroy him." The line went quiet, except for her breathing, steady and determined, even at 87 years old. "I'm asking you to meet with him," she said finally, "just once, just long enough to look him in the eye and decide whether the man who arrested you is worth saving." That night, I sat in my quarters, surrounded by classified files and strategic assessments, making decisions about operations that affected thousands of people across multiple continents. But the hardest decision on my desk was a simple yellow note with a phone number and a message: "Derek Montgomery requests meeting. Urgent, time sensitive." My brother, who'd spent months building a case against me, who'd handcuffed me in front of our family, who'd accused me of being everything I'd spent 7 years proving I wasn't, now wanted mercy from the woman he tried to destroy. And I had 48 hours to decide whether the Montgomery family was worth saving from itself. I chose the meeting location carefully: Conference Room Alpha at Fort Harrington, a space designed for briefing foreign dignitaries and high-ranking officials. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the parade ground where soldiers trained daily, a view that would remind Derek exactly where he was and who he was meeting with. The room itself was intimidating by design: polished mahogany table, military portraits on the walls, American flag in the corner that had flown over combat zones I couldn't name in his presence. Derek arrived escorted by 2 federal marshals, not because he was considered dangerous, but because he was now a security risk whose movements had to be monitored. He wore civilian clothes, a cheap suit that looked like something from a department store clearance rack, a far cry from the police uniform he'd worn with such pride just days earlier. The contrast was deliberate on my part. I sat at the head of the table in my dress blues, every ribbon and medal properly positioned, looking exactly like what I was, a general conducting official business. The marshals positioned themselves by the door, but remained in the room. This wasn't a private family conversation. This was a classified military briefing with the civilian who'd compromised national security. Derek needed to understand that distinction from the moment he walked in. "Sit down, Mr. Montgomery," I said, using his civilian title rather than his suspended police rank. The formality wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. The days when he could call me his little sister and expect family privileges were over. Derek took the chair opposite me, his hands shaking slightly as he folded them on the table. Up close, I could see he'd lost weight. Could see the dark circles under his eyes and the way his collar hung loose around his neck. The confident police sergeant who'd handcuffed me was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he'd been hollowed out from the inside. "Thank you for seeing me," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve—" "You don't," I interrupted, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned from commanding soldiers in combat zones. "You don't deserve this meeting, this opportunity, or any consideration beyond what federal law requires. But Grandmother Rose asked me to look you in the eye before making my final decision about your future. So here we are." The words hit him like physical blows. I watched him flinch, watched him realize that the sister he'd grown up with, the one who'd helped him with homework and covered for him when he broke curfew, was gone. In her place sat a general who'd ordered airstrikes and managed intelligence networks, someone for whom his destruction was just another strategic decision. "I need you to understand something before we go any further," I continued, pulling out a classified file that I placed on the table between us. The cover bore enough official markings to make clear this wasn't family business anymore. "This meeting is being recorded. Everything you say will be reviewed by federal investigators. Everything you admit will be used in determining your prosecution. Do you understand?" Derek nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "I need verbal confirmation, Mr. Montgomery." Yes, I understand." I opened the file, revealing photographs and documents that detailed the scope of his surveillance operation against me. Screenshots of his computer searches, copies of the photos he'd taken, transcripts of phone calls where he discussed his suspicions with other officers. The federal investigation had been thorough, revealing a pattern of behavior that went far beyond Sunday dinner accusations. "Tell me about this," I said, sliding one of the surveillance photos toward him. It showed me leaving the Pentagon after a classified briefing, taken with a telephoto lens from a considerable distance. "Tell me about how you acquired this image." Derek stared at the photo like it was evidence of someone else's crimes. I hired a private investigator, someone who specialized in insurance fraud cases. I told him I suspected you were living beyond your means, maybe running some kind of scam. You hired civilian contractors to conduct surveillance on a military intelligence officer." My voice remained level, professional, but the implications hung in the air like toxic gas. "Do you understand what that means in terms of national security?" "I didn't know," Derek whispered. "I swear to God, Arya, I didn't know who you really were." "My name," I said coldly, "is General Montgomery, and your ignorance isn't a defense. It's an indictment. A competent police officer investigating suspected federal crimes would have contacted federal agencies. A responsible law enforcement professional would have verified jurisdictional authority before making arrests. You did neither." I pulled out another document, this one showing the financial records of his private investigator, a man whose background check revealed connections to foreign nationals and a history of selling information to the highest bidder. "Your hired contractor sold intelligence about my movements to parties unknown. Because of your amateur investigation, hostile foreign agents now have detailed information about my patterns, my residence, my personal life. Do you understand what that means for my safety and the safety of my operations?" Derek's face went gray. No, I didn't. He said he was former military. Said he understood operational security."
"He lied," I said. "Just like you lied when you told our family you were protecting them."
"Just like you lied when you claimed this was about stolen valor instead of what it really was. Jealousy and resentment toward a sister whose success you couldn't understand or accept." The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant sound of military training exercises outside the windows. Soldiers learning to follow orders, to trust their chain of command, to put mission before personal feelings, everything Derek had failed to do. "What do you want from me?" Derek asked finally, his voice cracking like it had when we were children, and he'd been caught in lies that seemed important then, but were insignificant compared to this. "I want you to understand what you've cost," I said, closing the file. With a snap that echoed through the room. 3 ongoing intelligence operations have been compromised and had to be terminated. 18 months of work by over 40 intelligence professionals wasted. 2 foreign assets who trusted us enough to provide critical information are now dead because their covers were blown when we had to extract them suddenly. Each fact landed like a physical blow. Derek's breathing became more labored with each revelation, each consequence that reached far beyond our family drama. "I want you to understand that your actions didn't just humiliate me at Sunday dinner. They didn't just damage our family relationships. They got people killed. Derek, people who were helping keep Americans safe died because you couldn't handle having a successful sister." Derek was crying now. Silent tears that he didn't bother to wipe away. "What can I do? How can I fix this? Tell me how to make this right." I stood up, my dress blues crisp and authoritative, looking down at the broken man who'd once been my big brother. "You can't fix this, Mr. Montgomery. You can't bring back the dead. You can't undo the intelligence losses. You can't erase the security breaches." I walked to the window, looking out at soldiers who understood duty and sacrifice, who would never compromise their mission for personal grievances. "But you can do one thing," I said without turning around. "You can accept responsibility, full responsibility. No excuses about misunderstandings or family loyalty or protecting anyone. You can admit that you compromised national security because you were jealous of your sister's success and too prideful to investigate properly." When I turned back to face him, Derek was staring at his hands, at the wedding ring that might not mean anything much longer, at the future that had been destroyed by his own choices. "And then," I said, returning to my seat with the bearing of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions, "you can accept whatever consequences federal prosecutors determine are appropriate for your crimes, without appeals, without family intervention, without asking the woman you tried to destroy to save you from yourself." The meeting was over. I had looked Derek in the eye, just as Grandmother Rose had asked, and what I seen was a man who'd chosen to tear down rather than build up, who'd chosen suspicion over trust, who'd chosen his ego over his family's safety. The power in that room had shifted completely. Derek, who'd worn authority like armor just days earlier, sat defeated and diminished. I, who'd endured handcuffs and humiliation in front of our family, now held his future in my hands with the same calm I'd used to authorize any other military operation. The only question remaining was whether mercy or justice would serve national security better. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Derek's arrest, when I was reviewing intelligence briefings in my office at Fort Harrington. My aide, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, knocked on my door with an expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between awe and concern. "General, you need to see this," she said, handing me a tablet displaying the front page of the Washington Herald. It went live 20 minutes ago. The headlines stretched across the screen in bold letters that seemed to pulse with their own authority. "Decorated general arrested by brother at family dinner. Federal investigation reveals small-town cops stunning. Ignorance of sister's military career." Below it was a photograph I recognized immediately. Me in dress blues at last year's Pentagon ceremony, receiving the Defense Superior Service Medal from the Secretary of Defense himself. But it wasn't just any photo. It was the official portrait that hung in classified briefing rooms, the one that showed every ribbon, every decoration, every symbol of 7 years of service that Derek had dismissed as costume jewelry. How did they get this? I asked, though. I suspected I already knew. Military journalists had been sniffing around the story since Derek's arrest made waves through federal law enforcement circles. A local police sergeant arresting a general for impersonating herself was too bizarre, too ironic, too perfectly symbolic of civilian ignorance about military service to stay classified forever. Pentagon Public Affairs authorized the release. Patricia explained. The story was going to break anyway. Too many people knew about it. Better to control the narrative than let rumor and speculation take over. I scrolled through the article, watching 7 years of my classified career become public knowledge in carefully sanitized details. The reporter had clearly been given access to my non-classified service record, the parts of my story that could be told without compromising ongoing operations. General Arya Montgomery, 32, has served with distinction in multiple combat zones and currently holds one of the most sensitive positions in military intelligence, the article read. Her achievements include graduating second in her class from the elite Ranger School, commanding a brigade-level intelligence unit in Afghanistan, and developing strategic protocols that have been credited with preventing multiple terrorist attacks on American soil. Each paragraph felt like vindication and violation simultaneously. These were accomplishments I'd never been able to share with my family. Achievements I'd carried in silence for years while they questioned my mysterious career and Derek built his case for my fraudulent existence. The arrest occurred during a family gathering at the home of Montgomery's 87-year-old grandmother in Willowbrook. The article continued. According to federal sources, Sergeant Derek Montgomery had conducted months of surveillance on his sister, convinced she was impersonating a military officer based on what he termed suspicious behavior and lack of verifiable employment. My phone started ringing immediately. The first call came from General Marcus Steinberg, my former commanding officer in Afghanistan, his voice carrying the mixture of disbelief and barely controlled rage that I'd heard him use when dealing with politicians who questioned military strategy. Arya, I just saw the Herald piece. Please tell me this is some kind of elaborate joke. Please tell me a police sergeant didn't actually arrest you for being exactly what you are. It's not a joke, sir. And it gets worse. The surveillance he conducted compromised 3 operations and led to the death of 2 assets. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for me to hear him processing the full implications. Jesus Christ, he breathed.
How?
Is this not front-page news everywhere? It will be, I said, watching new notifications pop up on my screen as the story spread across social media and news platforms. The Pentagon is controlling the release, but the basic facts are now public. By noon, my story was trending on every social platform. #General Montgomery became a rallying cry for women in the military, for siblings overshadowed by conventional success, for anyone who'd ever been doubted by people who should have known better. The comment sections filled with outrage, disbelief, and stories from other service members who'd faced similar skepticism from their own families. The phone calls started coming from news producers, from military historians, from women's advocacy groups who wanted to use my story as an example of the invisible barriers female service members still faced. Each call felt like another layer of my carefully protected privacy being stripped away, but also like recognition I'd never been able to claim. CNN ran the story as their lead piece at 6 p.m., with military correspondent Barbara Starling providing context that made Derek's actions look even more absurd. To understand the magnitude of this error, Starling explained to a national audience. Imagine a mall security guard arresting the CEO of the company that owns the mall for trespassing in her own building. General Montgomery doesn't just outrank her brother. She exists in a completely different universe of authority and responsibility. The network had somehow obtained security footage from the Pentagon showing me entering the building for high-level briefings, walking past guards who snapped to attention as I passed. The visual contrast between Derek's accusations of fraud and the reality of my actual position was devastating in its clarity. By evening, the story had reached international news outlets. The BBC ran a piece titled, "American Police Officer Arrests Sister, Discovers She Outranks His Entire Department." Le Monde called it a perfect symbol of American military civilian disconnect. Even Chinese state media picked up the story, using it to criticize American law enforcement training. But the most powerful coverage came from Military Times, the publication that actual service members read and trusted. Their editorial was titled, "When Your Brother Doesn't Recognize Your Service," and it spoke directly to the thousands of military families struggling with similar misunderstandings. General Montgomery's story isn't unique in its family dynamics. The editorial read. What's unique is how public her humiliation became, and how clearly it illustrates the gap between military reality and civilian perception. How many other decorated officers have sat at family tables unable to explain their importance, their sacrifices, their achievements because their work requires the silence that protects us all? The editorial went viral among military communities, shared by thousands of service members who'd experienced their own versions of Derek's ignorance. The comment sections filled with stories of parents who didn't understand deployment schedules, siblings who questioned the value of military service, spouses who'd left because they couldn't handle the secrecy that came with classified work. My grandmother called that evening, her voice stronger than I'd heard it since the arrest. "Arya, sweetheart, I've been getting phone calls all day. Reporters, neighbors, people from church. Everyone wants to know about you, about what really happened, about who you really are." She paused, and I could hear the television in the background, probably showing my story on the evening news. I told them all the same thing. I told them, "You've always been exactly who you said you were. We just weren't smart enough to listen." The validation felt overwhelming after years of carrying secrets alone. But it also felt incomplete because the people who most needed to understand my family had required a federal investigation and national media coverage to see what should have been obvious from their love and trust. Late that night, I received a message through official channels that made everything else pale in comparison. It was from the families of the two intelligence assets who died because Derek's surveillance had compromised their operations. Not anger or blame, but gratitude for my service and condolences for what my family had put me through. "General Montgomery," one message read, "our husband died doing what he believed in, working with Americans he trusted. We want you to know that. His sacrifice wasn't meaningless, and neither is yours." Another stated, "The world now sees what we always knew, that heroes come in many forms, and sometimes the people closest to them are the last to recognize their courage." The external validation was complete, overwhelming, and bittersweet. The entire world now knew what Derek had refused to see, what my family had been too blind to recognize, what I'd carried in silence for 7 years. But recognition from strangers, however gratifying, couldn't repair the damage done by the people who should have known me best. The letter arrived on official Department of Justice letterhead, delivered by courier to my office on a Friday afternoon when the media storm had finally begun to settle. I recognized the case number immediately: United States versus Derek Montgomery. The federal prosecution that had consumed the last month of my life and destroyed what remained of my family's illusions about themselves. Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Chun had attached a personal note to the formal documents. "General Montgomery, the defendant has requested a plea conference. He's asking to speak with you before finalizing his agreement. While this is highly unusual, given the unique circumstances of this case, we're willing to accommodate the request if you consent. Please advise." Derek wanted one final conversation before accepting responsibility for what he'd done. One last chance to explain himself, to ask for understanding, to somehow bridge the gap between the brother who'd raised me and the man who'd handcuffed me in front of our family. The request felt simultaneously reasonable and insulting. Reasonable because he was facing 15 years in federal prison. Insulting because he still believed his feelings mattered more than the consequences of his actions. I scheduled the meeting for the following Tuesday in the same conference room where we'd had our previous encounter. This time, however, Derek's defense attorney would be present along with federal prosecutors and a court reporter. This wasn't family business disguised as official proceedings. This was official proceedings that happened to involve family. Derek looked worse than before. The cheap suit had been replaced by orange prison scrubs, the confident police officer's bearing completely gone. His hands shook as he signed the waiver, acknowledging that anything he said could affect his sentencing. That this conversation was part of the legal record, that the sister he'd arrested was now effectively deciding his fate. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice barely audible in the sterile conference room. "I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you anymore." "You don't," I agreed. taking my seat across from him with the same military bearing I'd maintained throughout this ordeal. But the prosecutors believe this conversation might provide closure for both of us before sentencing. I'm here in that capacity only. Derek's attorney, a young public defender who looked overwhelmed by the federal nature of this case, shuffled through papers nervously. General Montgomery, my client wants to express his remorse and take full responsibility for his actions. He's prepared to plead guilty to all charges without attempting to minimize his culpability. I understand that's his legal strategy, I replied. What I don't understand is why he believes I need to hear his remorse personally. Derek leaned forward, his eyes red with exhaustion and something that might have been genuine regret. Because I need you to know that when I handcuffed you in Grandma's dining room, when I accused you of being a fraud, when I called you a liar in front of our entire family, I wasn't thinking about your safety or your service or anything beyond my own pride. The admission hung in the air like confession, raw and painful in its honesty. I was jealous, Arya. I was jealous that you'd found something important to do with your life, while I was writing traffic tickets in Willowbrook. I was jealous that you had money and freedom and respect that I'd never earn. I was jealous that Grandma Rose looked at you like you were special while I was just ordinary. I'd expected deflection, excuses, attempts to minimize his actions by emphasizing his ignorance. Instead, I was hearing something that sounded like actual accountability. The kind of honesty that came too late to matter, but that might represent genuine understanding of what he'd destroyed. So you decided to destroy what you couldn't achieve. I said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact that needed to be acknowledged. You decided that if you couldn't be successful, you'd prove that my success was fraudulent. Yes, the word came out like a physical blow to himself. And in doing that, I didn't just hurt you. I didn't just embarrass our family. I got people killed. People whose names I'll never know. People who trusted America enough to help us and died because I couldn't handle being my sister's brother. The prosecutors exchanged glances, recognizing that Derek's admission was more complete than most defendants ever managed. This wasn't a man trying to minimize his sentence through false remorse. This was someone who finally understood the scope of what his jealousy had caused. The federal investigation found that your surveillance operation compromised not just current operations but historical ones, I said, pulling out a classified summary that had been cleared for this conversation. Foreign intelligence services traced your contractors' activities back 18 months, identifying patterns that allowed them to uncover previous assets and operations. The final count is 7 dead, General Montgomery. 7 people who died because you hired a compromised private investigator to prove your sister was lying about her career. Derek's face went white, then gray, then something approaching green. 7 people. 7 people whose families will never know why they died, whose sacrifice will never be acknowledged publicly, whose children will grow up believing their parents died in accidents or random violence. 7 people who died for your ego. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over keys that couldn't capture the weight of what we were
discussing.
What do you want from me? Derek asked finally, his voice cracking like it had when we were children and he'd broken something valuable. What can I possibly say or do that would make any difference now? I stood up, walked to the window that overlooked the parade ground where soldiers train for missions Derek would never understand, and made a decision that had been building since the moment he'd handcuffed me. I want you to stop asking for forgiveness from the people you've wronged, I said without turning around. I want you to stop expecting family loyalty to override federal crimes. I want you to stop believing that being my brother entitles you to consideration beyond what any other criminal receives. When I turned back to face him, Derek was crying. Not the quiet tears of remorse, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who finally understood that some damage can't be undone. I'm recommending that you receive the maximum sentence allowable under federal guidelines, I continued, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned from ordering airstrikes and managing intelligence operations. 15 years in federal prison. No possibility of early parole, no consideration for family circumstances or previous service to your community. Derek's attorney started to object, but I held up my hand with the kind of gesture that stopped conversations in briefing rooms. Around the world. This isn't revenge, Mr. Montgomery. This is consequences. This is what happens when someone compromises national security because they can't handle their family dynamics. This is what happens when jealousy becomes treason. I gathered my files, prepared to leave this room and this conversation forever. 7 families lost people they loved because you needed to prove your sister was a fraud. Those families deserve justice more than you deserve mercy. At the door, I paused for one final statement that would close this chapter of my life permanently. Derek, I want you to understand something. As you serve your sentence, every day you spend in federal prison, remember that you put yourself there, not the prosecutors, not the judge, not the federal agents who investigated your crimes. You chose surveillance over trust. You chose public humiliation over private conversation. You chose to destroy rather than build, to tear down rather than celebrate, to punish rather than protect. I opened the door, then looked back at the broken man who'd once been my big brother. And when you get out in 15 years, if you get out, don't contact me. Don't contact our family. Don't expect reconciliation or forgiveness or any acknowledgement that we share DNA. You killed that relationship when you handcuffed me for being exactly what I told you I was. The door closed behind me with a finality that felt like justice. Derek Montgomery would spend the next 15 years learning what consequences looked like when you betrayed someone who dedicated their life to protecting people who would never know their name. And I would spend the rest of my career ensuring that his mistakes never cost any more lives. 2 years later, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, watching the sunrise paint the Potomac River in shades of gold and crimson. The view stretched across the water to the monuments that reminded me daily why my work mattered, why the sacrifices were worth making, why protecting secrets sometimes meant protecting the people you loved from truths they couldn't handle. The apartment itself was a study in controlled minimalism, government-issued furniture arranged with military precision, classified documents secured in a safe that most people would mistake for modern art, and walls decorated with photographs from operations I could never discuss but would never forget. It was a space that reflected exactly who I'd become, someone who'd learned to build a life around duty rather than relationships, around mission rather than family, around service, rather than the comfortable illusions that most people called love. My morning routine had evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who'd once driven to Sunday dinners hoping for acceptance. I began each day with intelligence briefings from 3 continents, reviewed overnight reports from assets whose lives depended on my decisions, and made strategic assessments that affected the safety of Americans who would never know my name. By the time most people were deciding what to wear to work, I'd already made choices that could prevent terrorist attacks or uncover foreign intelligence operations. The work had expanded since Derek's arrest, partly because the media attention had elevated my profile within military circles, but mostly because competence always led to greater responsibility. I now commanded a joint task force that coordinated intelligence operations across multiple agencies, briefed the National Security Council on threats that kept other generals awake at night, and developed protocols that would be used by future generations of intelligence officers. But the real transformation wasn't professional. It was personal. The woman who'd endured handcuffs in her grandmother's dining room had evolved into someone who understood that family loyalty was a luxury that people in my position couldn't always afford. I'd learned to build relationships based on mutual respect and shared mission rather than blood ties and childhood memories. I discovered that the people who earned the right to know you were often the ones who never questioned your worth in the first place. My chosen family now included Colonel Patricia Hayes, who'd become not just my deputy, but the sister I'd never had. Someone who understood the weight of classified burdens and shared the dark humor that kept intelligence officers sane. Major General Sandra Clark, my mentor and friend, who taught me that women in our field had to be twice as good to get half the credit, but that excellence was its own reward. Captain Maria Santos, a younger officer I was mentoring, who reminded me, daily that the next generation of female military leaders would face fewer barriers because of battles we'd fought in silence. These relationships were built on choice rather than obligation, on earned trust rather than assumed loyalty. They were forged in briefing rooms and combat zones, tested by classified crises and strategic decisions, strengthened by shared understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. When these women looked at me, they saw exactly what I was: a general, a leader, a guardian of secrets that protected the freedoms others took for granted. The Montgomery family had tried to reconnect several times over the 2 years since Derek's sentencing. Uncle Martin called every few months, his voice carrying the desperate hope of someone who believed that time could heal wounds that went deeper than misunderstanding. Aunt Helen sent Christmas cards with carefully neutral messages about family, love, and forgiveness. Cousin Jasmine reached out through social media, sharing family photos that included an empty space where I might have stood if things had been different. But Grandmother Rose's call, when it came, was different. "Arya, sweetheart," her voice carried the authority of 89 years and the wisdom of someone who'd watched families rise and fall through decades of joy and tragedy. "I'm calling to tell you something I should have said 2 years ago, and I'm calling to ask for something I have no right to request." I'd been expecting this conversation since Derek's conviction, had rehearsed responses that balanced respect for her age with clarity about my boundaries. But something in her tone suggested this wasn't another plea for family reconciliation. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you," she continued. "Not because you're successful, not because you've achieved things I don't understand, but because you chose duty over comfort. You chose protection over popularity. You chose to serve people who will never thank you rather than please people who never deserved you." The words hit harder than I'd expected, carrying validation from the one family member whose opinion had always mattered most. But they also carried something else, the recognition that she finally understood why I couldn't come home again. "What I'm asking for," Rose said slowly, "is permission to be proud of you publicly. Permission to tell people about my granddaughter, the general, about the woman who serves her country in ways I can't comprehend, but that I know matter. I'm asking for the right to claim you, Arya, even though we failed you when it counted." The request was both touching and painful, recognizing that my achievements had become a source of pride for people who doubted them when they required faith rather than proof. But it also represented something I'd been building toward for 2 years, the ability to accept recognition on my own terms, rather than seeking approval from people who'd conditioned their love on their understanding. "You can be proud, Grandma," I said, looking out at the river that carried history toward the sea. "But understand that the granddaughter you're proud of isn't the same person who used to come to Sunday dinner hoping you'd accept her mysterious career. She's someone who learned that respect is earned through action, not granted through relationship. She's someone who builds her own family from people who see her clearly rather than trying to fix people who prefer their comfortable blindness." The conversation ended with love, but not with reconciliation. Rose understood, in the way that very old and very wise people sometimes do, that some transformations are so complete that return becomes impossible. I was no longer the Aya who'd needed her family's approval to feel worthy. I was someone who'd learned to measure worth by mission accomplished, lives saved, threats neutralized. That evening, I hosted a small dinner party in my Alexandria apartment. Patricia, Sandra, Maria, and 3 other female officers whose careers had been shaped by the knowledge that excellence was our only path to equality. We talked about current operations within the limits of classification, shared war stories that would never appear in official histories, and planned strategies for mentoring the next generation of women who would follow in our footsteps. As the sun set over the Potomac, Sandra raised her glass in a toast that captured everything I'd learned about family, loyalty, and the choice between belonging and being true. "To the families we build," she said, "and the families we outgrow. To the people who see us clearly and the courage to let go of those who prefer us blurry. To service that matters more than comfort, and to women who choose mission over approval." We drank to that truth, to the understanding that some of us are called to protect rather than belong, to serve rather than be served, to carry secrets that keep others safe rather than share stories that make us popular. And as I looked around, that table at women who'd earned their place through competence and courage, I realized that Derek's greatest failure wasn't arresting his sister for impersonating an officer. His greatest failure was never understanding that the best families aren't assigned by birth. They're chosen by people who recognize your worth before the world validates it, who stand with you when the mission gets difficult, and who never need to handcuff you to prove their own importance. The woman who'd once driven to Willowbrook hoping for acceptance had become someone who created acceptance, who built rather than begged, who served at levels that required no explanation to people who mattered. That transformation, born from betrayal and forged in the choice between family loyalty and national service, had taught me the most valuable lesson of my military career. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's outgrowing the need for approval from people who were too small to see your worth in the first place.